Hello everyone, welcome to VizConnect, connecting you with the art of data visualization and storytelling. My name is Sagar Kapoor. I'm part of customer success team at Tableau. It's an honor and privilege to welcome Alberto Cairo to VizConnect. Alberto is a journalist and designer and the night chair in visual journalism at the School of Communication of the University of Miami. He's also the director of visualization program at UM's Center for Computational Science. He has been head of information graphics at media publication in Spain and Brazil. The author of several textbooks, Alberto currently consults with companies and institutions and has provided visualization training. Today, he will talk about the art of insight, becoming a better visualization reader. So, without further ado, it's over to Alberto.
My fan, because it's getting warmer down here in Florida. So anyway, yeah, I mean, I have a slide deck ready. I may not go over all the slides, and what I will do also later is to export during the Q&A. I will export these slides as a PDF, and I will share them through a Dropbox link with everybody in the meeting today, so you can all have access to these slides because they contain links to resources and different articles and projects, etc. But anyway, so yeah, I really care about helping people become better readers of visualization. I think that before we can be a good designer of visualizations, we need to be good readers of visualization. We need to interrogate the things that we see every day in the media and in social media, and we need to educate ourselves in reading them better. Before I get started, by the way, some of the slides you will see contain those funny, colorful bubbles in the background. So I'm going to credit the author of those abstract illustrations. They all come from a project that I art directed, designed by Nadi Bremer. If you don't know Nadi, she's, in my opinion, one of the most talented visualization designers in the world at the moment. So I had the privilege to work with her in 2 or 3 projects already. And this is just one of them, Why Do Cats and Dogs, which is a project based on Google data, Google search data. And the project visualizes what people search for when we search for, why is my dog doing, what comes next, right? So very popular searches in Google are, for example, why is my dog licking my leg? Or why is my dog eating poop? Or things like that, right? So the project is very funny. It's very engaging and visualizes, again, search data. And it also includes very cute animations, illustrations and animations made by Juliana Chen, a very talented illustrator. So I would really recommend that you visit this project. I just wanted to credit them. In any case, so why do I believe that, or why do I think that helping people become better readers of visualization matters? Well, because most of us, I guess, will at some point design visualizations in our work environments, right? But perhaps not all of us, but all of us will have to be readers of those visualizations. So it's extremely important that we all acquire some knowledge of the syntax of these graphics, right? Of the grammar of these graphics, how they work, right? It's because we are surrounded by them. I often say that we are living right now through a second golden age of data visualization. The first golden age of data visualization was the 19th century, with people such as Florence Nightingale or John Snow or Charles Joseph Minard, people like that, right? It's like all that in the 19th century. And then we went through sort of like a semi-dark ages of visualization at the beginning of the 20th century. And then at the end of the 20th century, the second golden age of visualization began with the work of certain statisticians and data scientists, and later on, designers, journalists, and everybody joining. All right, and now we are experiencing an explosion in the use of data visualization in business analytics, in the sciences, in data science, in statistics, in the world of journalism, the world that I come from. In the world of journalism, in particular, visualizations are broadly and widely used. Particularly in the countries that I'm most familiar with, which are Spain, Brazil, and the United States. Mainly because through their analytics, media organizations are seeing that people really like to see visualizations. Or it's like when we publish a visualization and the visualization is really well made, that visualization increases engagement greatly. And some of the most popular pieces of content ever published by the largest media organizations, for instance, in the United States, have been data visualizations. The most viewed piece of content ever published by the Washington Post online was this project that you have on the screen right now, which is a simulator of how a pandemic spreads in a country, if measures are taken to contain it, or if measures are not taken to contain it, how differently that thing will spread. However, there are also many misconceptions related to visualization, and I have devoted part of my work to try to dispel some of these misconceptions. I address some of them in some of my latest books, right? Sentences such as, a picture is worth 1,000 words, that is not true, or visualization is intuitive, that is also not true. Visualization needs to be learned. Again, we need to be good readers of visualizations before we can be good designers of visualizations. Or the ever-present, particularly in worlds such as business analytics, just show me the data. The data should speak for itself, and data never speaks for itself. You need to make it talk. What really matters actually when we play with data is not the data itself, right? It's the interpretation of the data that really matters, right? The data is just something that supports decision-making, right? Supports insight, the extraction of insights. Or in the world that I come from, the world of journalism, the world of graphic design, also the ever-present show, don't tell, which is a recommendation that I have received in the past. And in the past, I applied it, right? I try to just show and tell very little, right? And I have come to believe that this is completely wrong. We need to show and tell. We need to show and explain. Therefore, the understanding of a graphic may happen through the interaction of the graphic itself, but also the words that support that graphic, either written or spoken. So I usually append the second part of the question of the sentence, right? So I usually joke that a picture may be worth 1,000 words, but only if you know how to read it, right? And that's the reason why it's so important to become a good reader of charts, which is what my latest books are all about, right? How Charts Lie, the latest one, and The Truthful Art, both are at the core books that relate to how to be better readers of visualizations, right? In any case, I'm not going to talk about these books a lot. What I would like to discuss is some ideas that are sort of like bubbling up in my mind right now, and that will probably end up in a follow-up book that hopefully will be published around the beginning of 2022 or something like that. Because in that new book, what I would like to discuss is certain questions that I think that all designers need to ask themselves. And as an extension of that, readers should also ask themselves whenever we design a visualization, right? And again, I'm not going to go over all this content. I'm just going to show you the questions and perhaps one example. But the first question, particularly for people like me, right, who produce graphics that are going to be published to be consumed by the general public, although it's a question that people who work in contexts such as business analytics should also ask themselves, is why should my visualization exist in the first place, right? In a business analytics context, the question should be, should I make a visualization, or should I make a table, or should I just say, convey the message that the data hides just through words, right? It's like, do I really need a visualization? That's the first thing. And in the world of journalism, particularly when we deal with very sensitive topics, we should also ask ourselves whether the visualization may harm people, right? It's an extremely important question to ask. And I'm going to show you just one example that probably will end up in the following book, which is this one. In 2012, at the end of 2012, there was a terrible mass shooting in the United States, in a primary school, in an elementary school, called Sandy Hook Elementary in Connecticut. 20-something children were killed by a shooter. It was a horrible, horrible event. And a few days later, a newspaper in the state of New York, the Journal News, published this map. What this map is showing is the position of people who have a gun permit in New York State, right? Now, when I saw this map, I was completely horrified, right? I said, why? Why are you doing this, right? And the newspaper justified their decision saying, we felt that sharing this data about gun permits, right, people who have gun permits in our area was important in the aftermath of the Newtown shootings. Now, I'm not going to get into the details about why I think that doing this is wrong, but I'm going to probably do that in the book. But what I would like you to think is the following. Whenever we do a graphic, we need to consider what benefits this graphic may have to the population, to the general population, and what harm that graphic may cause to the population that is being depicted in the graphic, right? Because the people who are depicted in this graphic, they are not criminals. They are just normal people who may have a gun permit. In the United States, having a gun permit doesn't mean that you have a gun at home. I could have a gun permit. I don't, but I could, right? But I would never dream to have a gun in my home just because I have small children, right? And that may be dangerous. And so does that mean that I should appear in a map like this? Why, right? And the why question is super important. Why? Why should this data made public? And more importantly, if we decide that we need to make it public, why should it be made public in this particular way? Aren't there other ways in which we can depict the density of gun owners in a certain area without pinpointing every single gun owner on a map and potentially putting sort of like a target on these people, right? Isn't there a way in which we can sort of like obtain the benefits of providing this information without harming the people who are being depicted in this information? This is even more important when we depict data related to communities that may be, for example, just think about it. There are many populations in the world, many people, many groups in the world that are being subject to harassment, right? The Rohingya, right? In Myanmar, for example. Would you ever depict the Rohingya this way? No, you should never do that. Just because visualizing data about underserved populations or populations under threat, people who are under threat, right? Or people who are being oppressed, may harm those populations. So we need to be extremely careful. We may harm, by the way, I would use the word, may harm those persons or those people, because sometimes we talk about populations like if it were an abstract thing. And we need to remember that behind data, behind these numbers that we are representing, there is people. And the main goal of a visualization is to benefit people, right? Persons, not to harm those people, right? So we also need to weigh all these things in our mind whenever we are designing a visualization. Second thing is, we need to ask ourselves whether we understand what it is that we are showing, right? What it is that we are representing, right? And this sounds like a no-brainer, but it is actually not. I have seen many graphics in the past in which the data is represented with a further explanation of the definitions of the metrics that are being represented. I'm going to show you just one example of how dangerous that can be, right? One of my former students, who is now a data journalist at the Wall Street Journal, his name is Luis Melgar. When he was studying at the university, he made a project about homelessness in Florida, right? Particularly focusing on students, right? How many students in Florida are homeless, right? Don't have a home. And he came back to me with several graphics and charts, etc. And some of them shocked me. For instance, this one. This map over here shows that in certain counties in Florida, 1 out of 5 students is homeless. 20%, more than 20% of the students are homeless. And I was like, oh, my reaction was like, whoa, what is going on over here? 1 out of 5 students are homeless? And Luis's explanation was to say, or reply was to say, I have not given you the definition of homeless person, right? The state of Florida has a very specific definition for what a homeless person is. Probably the idea that popped up to your mind was that a homeless person is someone who lives in the streets, right? But that's not a homeless person. A homeless person is simply someone who doesn't have a permanent home. That means that if a student, for instance, always has a roof over her head, but that roof changes because the student needs to change homes 3 times a year, right? Because her family perhaps is poor, I cannot afford staying in the same place all the time, 12 months in a row, etc. They need to change homes several times during a year. That student may be considered a homeless person to the eyes of the state of Florida. So that doesn't mean that the metric is wrong. It only means that we need to be careful. We need to understand very precisely, very accurately what it is that the metric is representing. We are seeing these very clearly. We saw these very clearly, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic. How many graphics we saw that said, number of cases of COVID-19 or number of deaths of COVID-19, right? That doesn't really capture the data that was being represented. Things have gotten better, and now news organizations are saying number of confirmed deaths, right? It's very important. That caveat is really important because we know that the number of deaths of COVID-19 are actually much higher than what the official numbers are representing. When we take a look at what is called the excess deaths, when we compare the number of deaths right now to the average number of deaths in past months, in previous years, similar to this one, we see an excess death, right? And which is actually higher than the number of cases that are being reported. Another question is who to visualize for. As I said before, I'm a great believer. I said that I was going to jump over some of these slides. I'm a great believer of explaining things to people and to use words to explain those things, right? Well, because we need to consider how the audience is going to absorb the information that we are presenting to them. Sometimes just showing the data is enough, but that is only when you are presenting to people who are like you and who share the same level of base knowledge that you have, right? If I am a statistician and I present to other statisticians in my same subfield, just showing the data is enough because people will have already the existing knowledge to interpret that visualization correctly. But if the same statistician presents the same data, the same information to me, I'm just a journalist, I'm not a statistician, that statistician better adds an explanation to that and explains the graphic to me and the data and the caveats and the exceptions and what it is that the graphic is trying to represent, right? We have many examples of how to do this well. Probably many of you are familiar with the work of Hans Rosling, for example. If you aren't, I may mention him in the chat window later. But he was a professor of global health in Sweden, very famous for explaining charts and data very, very clearly. This is just another one. This is Brian Stelter, a TV presenter from the United States. He works for CNN. At the beginning of the pandemic, he showed the famous flatten the curve graphic, but he didn't just show the graphic. He put himself in front of the graphic and then clearly explained what it was that the graphic was showing, emphasizing the main messages and explaining how to read the graphic. In visualization, we call the words that we add to graphics, we call them the annotation layer. This annotation layer is extremely important. Whenever we design a visualization, we should care not only about creating something that looks clear and nice and beautiful, but also adding words that may supplement the messages of the graphic. Writing a good title, writing a good introduction, writing good footnotes, writing good annotations here and there to emphasize the main messages of the chart. Some very famous visualization designers actually say that this is the most important thing that they do. Probably some of you have seen the visualizations that the Financial Times publishes on a regular basis, and they tweet out, right? One of the most popular designers at the Financial Times is John Bourne Murdoch. And John, in one interview that he had a while ago, he said that himself and the other people who work at the Financial Times, Alan Smith, who is the head of the data department over there, and other people over there, they say that they believe that the most important thing that they do is not just to visualize the data or to analyze the data. That's certainly important. But what they think that they can add of value to those visualizations is to add what they call that expert annotation layer that points out the important things in a graphic, that emphasizes the thing in a graphic, or that further explains and reiterates what the graphic is actually showing and what the graphic is not showing, perhaps. Another question is how much to visualize, right? So if you are in this conversation here today, probably all of you work in data, and you know that data can be aggregated or disaggregated at multiple levels, right? You can show every single observation, or you can show just an average, all right? Or steps in between, right? You can either disaggregate the data completely or aggregate the data completely and just show certain metrics, certain statistics that may capture or may not capture the reality of the underlying data set, or the complexity of the data set, right? Measures of central tendency and so on and so forth, right? In my latest book, How Charts Lie, I have several examples of sometimes showing every single observation may obscure the message of a graphic, but sometimes over aggregating the data and just showing you a very simple average or median or national rate or whatever may obscure the realities of the data, right? This is one of my favorite examples. The murder rate in the United States, 100 per 100,000 people at the national level, right? Increasing, then decreasing, and then in the past 2 or 3 years, right? This is from 2014, but the line continues increasing. From 2014 on, the murder rate in the United States is increasing again, right? So this line continues increasing. Now, if a reader, this is why it's so important to explain things to people, because if you just show me the data, right? People will jump to the wrong interpretations of this chart because they will describe this chart as the United States is becoming a more dangerous country. And that is actually not true. It is not true. The problem with this data set is the following. Most places in the United States are very safe. Most places in the United States, if we could plot them on the vertical axis, right, and the murder rate, we could calculate the murder rate of every town, every city in the United States. Most places will be around the national rate, right, or below the national rate. They will be around here, right? These are just imaginary dots, right? Each one of them representing a place. Now, the challenge here is that the distribution of the data is very skewed. The challenge is that there has been some places in the United States in which the murder rate in the past 5 years or so, or 6 years, has increased so much that they sort of like distort the national rate, right? Just because the murder rate in those places has, the number of murders in those places has increased so dramatically, right? Those extreme values distort the national rate a little bit. So that doesn't mean that this chart is wrong. It's only that the chart needs further explanation and context. That's the reason why the annotation layer is so important. If you cannot show every single data point because you don't have access to that data, you only have the access to the national rate, you can show the national rate, but then you better explain to people, hey, be careful, right? This increase in the national rate is probably due to the increase in these places. So it's not that the entire country is becoming more dangerous, it's that certain places have become much more dangerous. Therefore, perhaps the conversation should be moved not to how to solve crime everywhere in the United States, because we don't really have a crisis in the United States, but we may have something that we need to deal with in certain places. There may be some policies that we could implement to solve the challenge in these places. Then another graphic that I usually also use to explain this problem of aggregating, disaggregating, and also to talk other problems is this one, right? I usually joke, I can prove to a cigarette smoker, right, that smoking is good for his or her health through this graphic, right? That's obviously a joke because smoking is not good for your health. But it is very easy to read a chart like this as the more we smoke, the longer we live, right? Take a look at this chart. Each one of these dots is a country. And I have made that mistake myself, by the way, repeatedly, plenty of times, to carelessly describe what the chart is actually showing, right? Now, this chart is country by country. It shows you the association between annual cigarette consumption per person, that will be the horizontal axis, the position on the horizontal axis, and life expectancy in years, which is the position on the vertical axis, right? So as you can see, the higher the cigarette consumption is, the higher the life expectancy in years. Now, many of you probably thinking, well, this is a great example of correlation is not causation, right? It could be that cigarette consumption causes higher life expectancy, but we could have also a case of reverse causality, and it could be that life expectancy leads to more cigarette consumption, or it may be just there is no causal link between one thing or the other. There may be other variables that we are not considering that explain this statistical association between the two numbers, between the two variables. But we could go way beyond that, and we could use this example to explain certain principles of becoming a good reader of charts that are actually quite important, which is to always hammer to ourselves in our brain. And this is a mantra that I repeat in the previous book, in How Charts Fly, that a chart shows only what it shows and nothing else. Everything else that you see on a chart are inferences that you're making in your brain based on the chart. For instance, the inference, the more we smoke, the longer we live. That's not true. The chart is not showing that. All that the chart is showing is that there is a positive association between cigarette consumption, life expectancy, and vice versa. That's all that the chart is showing, right? Everything else are stories that you make up in your mind, and it's very easy to jump to those stories. We need to be extremely careful, but because we all do that, right? We all do that, jumping to conclusions, making up stories, etc. And it's also a great example to explain certain paradoxes and certain biases that affect us all. This is an example that could be used to explain two very common paradoxes and two very common fallacies. One of them is the ecological fallacy, and the other one is Simpson's paradox, and they're connected to each other in this case. So let's begin with Simpson's paradox. What is Simpson's paradox? Also called Simpson's paradox is part of a group of amalgamation paradoxes, right? Those paradoxes consist of the fact that there are patterns that you may see at a certain level of aggregation of the data, in this case, national level, that may completely disappear or may even reverse when you start disaggregating the data, right? Just because there are lurking variables here and there, right? In this case, the hidden variable is wealth. If we start disaggregating there could be others, that's just one. Wealth is just one. If we disaggregate the countries by wealth, we notice that the sort of like the association that we had before completely vanishes, right? There is no association anymore, or at least it's much weaker than before. And if we could disaggregate the data further at the regional level, local level, down to the individual level, we have very good evidence that when we look at data person by person, right, the association between cigarette consumption and life expectancy is the inverse. The more cigarettes a person consumes, the less years that person will tend to live in general, right? Obviously, there are people who smoke a lot and also live a lot, but it's much less likely, right? We have tons of evidence to show that when we take a look at survival rate charts, for instance, this one, right? We see in this case that the sample used to create this chart when people were at 40 years old, everybody was alive, 100%, but then people start dying, right? When we get to 80, right, take a look at that, there's a huge difference, right? 80 years old, right? 50% of the people who don't smoke or who stopped smoking many years ago are still alive, but only 26% of smokers are alive at 80, right? So the association between cigarette consumption and life length has reversed completely, right? So that's an example of an amalgamation paradox, right? A pattern that you saw at one level of aggregation was positive. The more cigarettes, the more the life expectancy. And suddenly when you disaggregate the data, the association has reversed. The more smoke, the less the life, or the fewer the years, right? And it's also an example of that ecological fallacy, which is what I wanted to get into, because this ails us all. And again, that's a mistake that I have made myself. One key rule in data analysis and also in data presentation and data understanding is that if you want to learn something about something, you need to collect data about something, right? That sounds so obvious and so stupid, right? But just put it this way. Imagine that you want to learn about yourself, right? You want to learn about whether the more we smoke, the longer we live. We as persons, right? The more I smoke, the longer I live. That means that you want data at the individual level. You want to learn about individuals. Therefore, in order to understand or to explore that question, you need data at the individual level, not at the national level. The national level tells you tells you nothing about individuals, right? If you want to know something about nations, countries, then by all means collect data at the national level, averages and rates, etc. But if you want to learn something about individuals, which is a completely different level of aggregation, you better collect data about individuals, not about countries. And you should never make an inference about persons based on data that is aggregated at a completely different level, regional level or a state level. Never. Or at least be extremely careful doing that, because that could be an ecological fallacy, and there could be an amalgamation paradox involved in this particular case. And then, how to choose graphic forms. I'm not going to get into these just because this will be the nitty-gritty, but I want to jump over these slides. There are certain websites that I recommend to people usually to help choices, right? To make help you make better choices when designing visualizations, right? It's very, very important to follow, guidelines and ideas. And always remember when you're shaping your data visually to remember that the design of a graphic and the features that we put on a graphic should always depend on the purposes of that graphic, right? Probably some of you, I'm going to go back to the slides that I have just jumped over. If you have read older books about data visualization, you probably have read the rule, and I'm going to use the air quotes in there, right? The rule: never use pie charts, for instance. Well, why? A pie chart may be appropriate in certain cases, right? I don't use them very often, but they might be appropriate, right? Take a look at this chart, for example. It's not a great chart, right? It could be improved, and I'm going to tell you how I would improve it, right? This is a chart that shows the total of migrants who arrived to Greece in 2016, where they came from, which percentage came from which country, right? This chart immediately, what it tells me is that almost half of the migrants who arrived to Greece were from Syria, right, in 2016. And then the other half came from other countries. And it conveys that message really, really well, right? So if it does convey that message really well, and that was the intended message that designer wanted to convey, right, then the chart works. There's nothing wrong with the chart. The only thing that I would change here will be to emphasize that message more by coloring Syria's portion with one color and then all the other portions with just a single color, perhaps gray, in order to emphasize that half versus half a little bit better, right? This is an example that I usually use in workshops to illustrate the idea that the choice of graphic form to represent the data should be dependent on the purpose of the visualization. If the purpose is to show half versus half and show parts of a whole, then the pie chart might be appropriate to represent the data. It will not be appropriate, though, if the purpose of the chart is to compare these countries to each other. Then the chart doesn't work that well because we are not very good at comparing angles, right? We are much better at comparing lengths or heights. Therefore, if the purpose of the graphic were comparison, we may use a bar chart. And if the purpose of the map is to show me where these countries are, right, we may need a map, right? So we could display the same data in at least 3 different ways or even more, right? Through a map, right? If we want to show where these countries are, and then bubbles to show the percentages of people coming from these countries. By the way, I'm seeing that these labels are misplaced. They should be closer to the bubbles, right? I drew this very quickly just to illustrate this. If we want comparison, we have evidence that, length or height or position to represent data is a much better way if we aim for precision and accuracy when estimating sizes. But then if we want to show half versus half, the pie chart is perfectly fine. So neither of these graphics, I usually say, charts are never good or bad in the abstracts. Charts are always better or worse, depending on how well they fulfill the intended purpose, the intended communication purpose that you have in mind when you design them. And either of these designs could be appropriate depending on that purpose, right? So whenever you're critiquing a chart, right, before jumping to a conclusion and say, oh, this chart is completely wrong, just first of all, think about what was the purpose of that chart? Why is that chart there? Why does it exist, right? And then finally, style. It's like what style to use, right? So most of the time when we design a visualization, we design what I would call meat and potatoes graphics, right? Bread and butter graphics, common graphics, right? Bar charts, line charts, etc. The types of graphics that we see every day, right? And that we use every day, right? 99% of the time, we will design a graphic like this, right? For our purposes. But sometimes it might be appropriate to get a little bit crazier with the data and to do something a little bit more creative. Again, just keep this in mind. 99% of the time, I would recommend to use just traditional types of graphics, traditional style, but sometimes it might be appropriate to do something wackier. I'm going to show you an example, and I will explain when I would use that type of example. This is my friend Jaime Serra. Jaime is a visualization designer from Spain. He's completely capable of creating graphics like these, but he's also an artist. So he does art based on numbers and based on data. He has done exhibits all over the world. Well, one of my favorite art pieces by Jaime is a visualization that he made of how much coffee he drinks over a year, right? Now, if I had to do that myself, I don't have a mug here in my office, but let's imagine that my cell phone is the coffee mug that I use every day to drink my morning coffee, right? If I want to visualize how much coffee I drink over a year, what I would do would be to get my coffee cup or my coffee mug and to draw a scale over here. And then when I pour coffee in, I will measure the number of ounces that I'm drinking. I will get that number, I will put it on an Excel spreadsheet, and then at the end of the year, I could draw a line chart, right? Like that one over there, line chart of coffee drinking per day, right? So I can spot patterns, ups and downs, etc. But Jaime wanted to create, in this case, something a little bit more artistically expressive, so to speak, right? So instead of visualizing data that way, or quantifying anything, what he did was first to get 12 pieces of paper, right? Large pieces of paper, like tabloid size or something like that, if I remember well. Imagine that that's the paper, right? And then what he did, right, was to start folding that paper like I'm doing right now, both vertically and horizontally, right? In order to create quadrants, right? So he unfolded it and he ended up with a piece of paper subdivided into rows and columns, like if it were a page from a calendar, right? So he had 12 pieces of paper, one paper per month. And then what he did was that when he was drinking coffee, right, he poured the coffee in, he shook the mug or the cup, right, in order to spill a little bit of coffee, just a tiny little bit of coffee. The coffee accumulated at the bottom, and then he put that thing on top of the corresponding quadrant of the calendar page to leave a stain on the paper. And then at the end, what he had was a physical visualization of coffee drinking, right? Now, obviously, this visualization, it is a visualization because it is quantifying the number of coffee cups that he was drinking, right? Through the stains left on the paper. It's not very analytically accurate, right? If you want analytical accuracy, it is much better to design a line chart, right? But the purpose of this graphic is not accuracy. The purpose of this graphic is, first of all, just to give you the big picture, just to give you sort of like the big patterns. And you can see them. I can see when he was drinking tons of coffee, very little coffee or no coffee at all. You can sort of like spot the different months and how the different months are different, right? In terms of he was probably drinking a lot of coffee in May. Maybe he was working a lot, and that's the reason why he was drinking so much coffee. So you can spot sort of like the patterns, right? But the main purpose of the graphic is not to sort of like give you very accurate access to the data, right? It's to capture your imagination and bring you into the information. So the way that I usually explain to people, particularly people who come from the world of data science and business analytics, what is the purpose of this type of graphic, right? Is to say 99% of the time you will design these. But 1% of the time, you may want to think about something like these. And these doesn't oppose that. You can have both. You can have these, and then you can have these. Imagine that you are designing a report for your company, right? And you, for some reason, your company decides to do a survey among all employees of how much coffee is drunk every year, right? Of all employees, right? And you collect all the data. You measure that throughout the year round, and you collect the data, you slice the data out into, age groups and, ethnicities, etc. You display and you write a report, right? What do you put inside the report? Well, you will put charts like these, right? Comparison between people, different groups, and so on and so forth. You will use traditional graphic forms. But what do you put on the cover to open up the report? You don't put any graphic like this. These are boring as hell. What do you put on the cover of the report? You put that. Because that is not only a visualization, it is also a great illustration that captures your attention and brings you into the data. Something similar could be said if you write sort of like an entire website about this data. You could open it up. This could be the header of the website. And then if you scroll down, you can get the more analytical graphics, right? So visualization doesn't just serve an analytical purpose or a communication purpose, communicative purpose. It can also serve to capture your imagination and bring you to the information, or perhaps giving you a different perspective of the data sometimes. And this leads me to the last example that I would like to show you today. The Washington Post yesterday published the latest project that I art directed, which was designed by a group of Brazilian designers. That project asks the question, what if all COVID-19 deaths in the United States had happened in your neighborhood? What about if everyone who died of COVID-19 were around you, right? So how big the circle around you would be? This was published yesterday. I'm going to just open it up for you. Here you can input any address that you want, right? I'm even just going to put an address over here. Miami, West Kendall, actually. There you go. So I'm going to put that address over here. There you go. Right. So I am there, right? I am there. This is your neighborhood on February 29th, Washington State, which is far from here, reported the first death from the novel coronavirus. So let's suppose, just for the sake of argument, that that person didn't live in Washington State. Let's suppose that that person lived in Florida and he was the person that you see every day when you go out in the morning, right? Your neighbor. Let's simulate that it was your neighbor around the corner, right? Then 1 month later, right, more than 93 people have died. Sorry, that's a week later. And then 1 month later, almost 13,000 people would have died around you. And that's how big the circle would be. By the way, each one of these dots represents a person, and this is all based on census data, census tract data from the United States, right? And now let's take a look at the present time, right? The current number of deaths of COVID confirmed, the number of confirmed deaths of COVID-19 in the United States right now. How big the circle around me would be, right? That's how big the circle would be. The circle will be, I think that it's like 3 miles around me. 3 miles is like 5 kilometers around me. Like 3 miles around me, right? Everybody inside that circle would have died if everyone who died of COVID-19 since January this year were my neighbors. Now I can share this map with everybody, right? I can just click on that and that will generate an image that I can share in social media, on Instagram, on Twitter, or whatever, right? So the purpose of this graphic is not to show you the number of cases per se. That has been done before, right? Line charts, bar graphs, maps, everybody's publishing those maps. The purpose of this visualization is to give you the data through a different angle. And it tries to achieve something that I think that is very important to consider when we design a visualization, which is to try to overcome what some psychologists call quantitative numbing. What is quantitative numbing? Well, when we see big numbers, it is very different to put those numbers to scale, right? 200,000 people. What does that look like, right? Or when you look at numbers from World War II, right? More than 60 million people died in World War II. That number is so enormous that it's very difficult to put it inside your brain. But we have evidence that when we put numbers at a human scale, suddenly something clicks inside your brain. This project was originally published in Brazil with Brazilian data, right? It's called No Epicenter, the epicenter. There you go. This was the original version of the project using Brazilian data, right? And now and later was picked up by the Washington Post and published with United States data. By the way, let me make an aside. If you want to do a project like this about your own country, you can do that. Just Google at the epicenter Lupa, which is the organization that published this originally, right? You will find this website in English, right? If you scroll down here, right? These links will take you to the source code of these projects. So you will be able to download it for free and then use it. The only other thing that you will need is detailed census data from your country, but you will be able to design something like this for your own country. Now, I was about to say, in Brazil, when this was published, tens of thousands of people share this in social media. And the most common, and now it is happening in the United States, is because the Washington Post is publicizing it right now and is growing in engagement right now. Readership is increasing very rapidly. I am following the reactions in social media, and the most common reaction that I'm seeing is, wow, I never imagined that this number was so big, right? I never put inside my head that this number was so big, which actually proves the point that the graphic is trying to say, right? It's like we need to put the data at a human scale in order for people to understand it. We also need to represent the numbers in more traditional manners, right? Number of cases, number of deaths, where they happen. So we can still use traditional graphics to represent the data, but sometimes as a supplement to that, as a complement to that, we may want to help people understand these numbers through a different angle, in a different way, all right? So they can compare those numbers to realities that they are aware of, such as how big their neighborhood is and what it would look like if everybody in their neighborhood had died. Anyway, so that's all that I have for today. I would just like to leave this last idea in your mind, which is that when we design visualizations, right? Again, I'm a great believer in thinking about the purpose of the visualization. When I teach visualization at the university, I tell students that the purpose of designing a visualization is not the visualization per se. That's just the means. That's just a tool that you use to achieve a higher purpose. And that higher purpose is understanding, right? Our goal when we design a visualization is to help someone else understand something. And if we do that through a visualization, if we do it through words, if we do it through a video, that doesn't really matter that much, because the ultimate goal is to help other people understand the world that surrounds them a little bit better. Anyway, that's all that I have for today. As I said before, while we have the Q&A, I will be exporting these slides as a PDF, and I will put them on the chat window for everybody to download. Okay.
Thank you, Alberto, for that. So we have a couple of questions for you. So let me so one thing everyone is asking about is, how is your journey started in the space of data visualization?
How I started?
That's right, yeah.
How I started?
What was your inspiration, passion about it, how you started?
Yeah.
Just you want to share something about
Sure. So it was a very, sorry, I'm trying to find the link to the I'll be back. I'm trying to find Cisco WebEx events. There you go. All right, so I'm going to put, before I forget, the link to the slides in the Dropbox, in the chat window. So you can download the PDF from there. Okay, so just save that link or just click on that, download the PDF of the slides to your computers. So I started by happenstance. I never meant to be a visualization designer in the first place. I studied journalism, and my goal by studying journalism was to work in radio. I love radio, and actually read the news in the radio when I was much younger than I am today. It's only that one of my teachers, one of my professors at the university knew that I can sketch things out. So if you give me a pencil and you give me a piece of paper and you ask me to draw a person, I can draw a person. It will look sort of like a comic book character or something like that, just because I read many comic books when I was a teenager, but I can sketch things out. I'm not a great artist, but I can sketch things out. So she recommended me to a graphics department in a newspaper. And that's how it all began. I began by doing mainly illustration-based visual explanations of current events, how an accident happened, how a terrorist attack happened. We do illustrations and maps and things like that. And then 10 years later, more or less, right into my career, I started getting interested in learning learning about graphs and maps more systematically. So I started studying cartography on my own by reading books, doing courses and things like that, and then a little bit of statistics. Although I already studied a little bit of statistics in high school, I picked up what I had learned 10 years before and started learning a little bit more systematically on my own. And that led to data visualization as a world. I began in that around 12, 13 years ago, or something like that. That's when I got into data visualization per se. So I have always been combining, I see data visualization as a small portion of what we could call information design, which is what I really care about. It's like, is the design, the meaningful arrangement of information in a way that information can be understood by the public. I learned tools, I taught myself how to use many tools. I read many books about visualization. And then more importantly, I practice a lot because we human beings, when we are trying to learn a craft, and visualization is based on science, obviously, but it's mainly a craft. It's like writing, right? In that sense, you cannot learn to be a good writer if you don't write. If you don't read and you don't write, you need to read because you need to copy from others, right? Copy in the sense not of plagiarizing, but on getting inspiration from other people and learn the techniques, and then putting those techniques at work by practicing. So I looked into the work of many people at the beginning of my career, famous infographics designers. At the moment, I try to follow everyone that I can to see what it is that they are working on, but my sources of inspiration at the moment are the usual suspects, right? in the United States, places like ProPublica or the New York Times or the Washington Post. In Spain, El País, which is a big newspaper over there, and they have an extraordinary graphics department. The Financial Times in London, Folha de São Paulo, Estado de São Paulo in Brazil, and many, many others. I try to essentially follow everyone. So it would be unfair for me to mention just, 2 or 3 sources of inspiration, because it's very general. I try to follow everyone that I can.
Thank you. I think there is a question for you about which books would you recommend for someone who has started out his career in data analysis and visualization?
I get that question a lot, so I'm going to answer it the same way that I answer it. It all depends on what you want to use visualization for. So if you're going to use it for data analysis and exploration, and particularly if you want to apply it to scientific research, I would recommend that you take a look at Tamara Mansner. So I'm going to write her name in the chat window. Tamara Mansner. I think that is visualization, design, and exploration or something. I don't remember the title. So look for Tamara Mansner's book about visualization. That will be one. Another one will be Colin Ware. I'm going to write his name also. Colin Ware, his book, which is already on the 3rd edition, and it's titled Information Visualization. I will recommend that one because that gives you sort of like the perception science perspective for visualization. I would recommend those two. I would recommend more for graphics for communication. I would recommend Cole Nussbaumer's book about visualization. It's titled Storytelling with Data, which is a book that deals with how to communicate effectively through data. I will begin with those 3, and then I will continue from there. Those 3 books will lead to more readings later on. It will lead to even my own books. It will lead to my own books at some point. I mean, you could also look into The Truthful Art, my second book. The Truthful Art is an introduction to visualization for exploration of descriptive statistics, right? To explore distributions and associations. So that will be The Truthful Art. It's very elementary, and I wrote it mainly for journalists and designers, but finally, it is being used mostly by data scientists as an intro. That is it's funny to read because I make jokes here and there, so it's lighthearted, I guess. So that's the reason why it got picked up. And then Stephen Few's books. Stephen Few. So Steve Few has several books about visualization. My favorite ones are Show Me the Numbers, that's his first book, and then Information Dashboard Design. And if you design business dashboards, the Big Book of Dashboards, I will recommend that one. So I will begin with those, I guess.
Thank you for that. And there is a question for someone with starts in analytics background. What should they do to their toolkit to design better digital visualization? The ones like shown. What software should learn, and any opinion on D3JS?
Yeah. So I have D3JS is great. I mean, if you have any background on JavaScript and web design, trying to learn D3. The challenge with D3 though is that if you don't have that type of background, the learning curve can be a little bit steep. So for absolute beginners, I usually recommend not to begin with coding because again the curve is quite steep. Begin with off-the-shelf tools, and nowadays plenty of tools that you can use, right? You can begin, for example, with the free versions of commercial tools, for example, Tableau or Power BI from Microsoft. I'm going to just write them here, Tableau and Power BI. Either of them is good to design data visualizations and dashboards, etc. But there are also, free or freemium solutions that you may want to explore. Flourish, for example, Flourish, Data Wrapper, Row Graphs, right? There are many tools out there that are free. Some of them are open source, and you can sort of like get in them, use them to get started in the field. Now, I would also recommend that you take a look at my own blog. So I'm going to send a link over here to my own weblog, because in my weblog I have a series of free video tutorials in which I teach how to use Flourish. I teach how to use, and then I teach also design tools such as Adobe Illustrator, which is a tool that every designer that I know, every visualization designer in the news that I know uses to create static graphics and static visualizations. Now, that said, if you want to have full control over your visualization and you want to publish your visualization on the web, then learning HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and as an extension of JavaScript, D3JS is quite important. At some point, you will need to learn a little bit about that, or at least partner up with people who know how to use it. Because I don't know, I'm not a JavaScript programmer, right? I use the tools that I mentioned in that link, plus a little bit of the R programming language, the letter R, right, which is a programming language for statistical analysis. So I use that a little bit, but I know very little JavaScript. So whenever I need to design a digital project, a digital visualization to be displayed, like the one from, the one of the deaths of coronavirus, for example, I don't design that myself. I may art direct that. So I may design the visual mock-up, how it would look like, right? The structure, let's put the menus here, let's put this here, and I will draw it as it would look like on an actual computer screen. And then people who know much more than I do about JavaScript develop the project. They create the actual JavaScript scaffolding of the visualization.
Thank you. And just a last question. So Daniel loved your book, How Charts Fly. So he's just asking any other book you're working on that, and if you want to share the title of or the main topic of it.
Sure. I mean, if you're interested in how to become a better, well, first of all, thank you for reading it. It's always a pleasure to know that people enjoy it. But if you like reading about how to reason about mathematics and how to reason about numbers and charts, etc., there are many books that you can consult nowadays. Fortunately, I'm going to type them here. You could consult Naked Statistics, for instance, by Charles Whelan. How Not to Be Wrong. There is another one that is going to be published soon, very, very soon in October, called Counting. I don't remember the author. She's a professor here in the US, Counting. And this is not out yet. This will be published in October. I just happened to read the draft of the book and I really liked it. This is a book that helps you think about numbers better. Weapons of Math Distraction by Cathy O'Neill. Is a book about algorithms and how algorithms may be biased also. The Art of Statistics. This was published this year. And then Calling Bullshit. This was published also this year. I will begin with those, but there are many others. There's an older one, for example, titled Bad Science, which is likely one of the books that I enjoy reading the most, is because the author, Ben Goldacre, he's very satirical. He's very British satirical, which is a type of satire that I really like. And he's very poignant. And the book is mostly focused on the medical sciences and how medical research is misreported in the media. And in the process of criticizing all these topics, he gives a very good introductory lesson on thinking critically about numbers. I will begin with those.
Thank you, Alberto. It was an honor to have you on VizConnect.
Likewise, thank you for having me.
Any closing comments you have?
Yeah. Just give visualization a try. Try to read a couple of books. Choose one tool. Don't be sort of like overwhelmed by the variety and amount of tools that are out there. Just pick one. Doesn't really matter which one, and just get started. Just get started producing visualizations. Then share your visualizations publicly, right, in social media or in forums, etc. And ask for opinions. Ask for other people's opinions, and take those opinions seriously, right? Look into the feedback that you will receive from the visualization community, and then practice. We learn by practicing and by copying other people, emulating other people. We don't learn only by reading a treatise about visualization. We learn by practicing. So do practice. It's a lot of fun. it's very useful, and it is a skill that is in high demand. And I think that demand will only increase in years to come.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alberto. It was a pleasure to have you on VizConnect.
Likewise.
Yeah,
Thank you for having me.
perfect. Have a great weekend ahead. Take care, and yeah, thank you.